Welcome to episode 2 of my Surreal Games You've Probably Never Heard of series. The first episode ended up seeing some unexpected popularity relative to many of my other videos. I found it surprising considering how mediocre of a video it is. Still, I felt obligated to make a sequel. Like the last time, this is a sampler pack of surreal or at least surreal adjacent games. Anything that's especially outlandish or unique in its presentation can end up on here. This time I'm more confident in both the quality and obscurity of the games in my lineup, so I'm hoping this is a much better experience. I want to keep the intro brief this time around, so I'll quickly regurgitate my rules and warnings from the last time. First, there will be no major spoilers. I'll only give you a detailed glimpse into each of these rather than a full analysis. Half the fun of these sorts of games is experiencing things for yourself, seeing the worlds as you play, and stumbling across secrets and oddities on your own. I don't want to show you all the cool things because ruining too many surprises will typically ruin these games. Second, I'm not allowing RPG Maker games, so there will be no blatant Yume Nikki clones. It's likely that I'll rescind this rule should I make a third video. Finally, I should issue a seizure warning, just in case. In my experience, none of these games had any content that could obviously induce seizures. However, it's entirely possible I missed something hidden far off the beaten path in at least one of these. I'll just give a blanket warning on the off chance I missed or forgot anything. If you're ever unsure, I suggest you look for a seizure warning issued by the developers themselves. At a bare minimum, nothing here requires you to pass through a horrific blinding flashing lights hellscape specifically engineered to make your eyeballs curdle. Anyways, enough talk, it's time to delve into some fever dreams. Let's start with a game that encompasses exactly what I'm looking for in a surreal game. Number 21, The World. I'll just call it 21 from now on. 21 is a game that's gonna stick with me forever. It may outright be among my favorite games of the dream exploration genre. It is such a wild, chaotic, definitively surreal game that it's almost hard to go into detail on it. And it's incredibly obscure too. There's simply very little documentation on this game on the internet, so we're in fantastic territory here. 21 is a goalless game. Well, mostly. The only objective listed on the game's official page is finding the legendary Reese's Puffs cow. Coincidentally, that's one of my goals in real life, too. I ultimately did find it, so revel in its glory with me for a moment. Anyways, 21 is structurally similar to the likes of Yume Nikki. You have a major hub, developer's bedroom, that leads into many different sub-areas. From there, you can explore these worlds and find even more obscure worlds tucked away inside of them. I'm fairly confident this weeaboo containment unit is the developer's real-life bedroom. Since it's based on their own dreams, it's fitting. They seem like a good guy, so I won't be too harsh on them for it. Those anime-adjacent themes do contribute to the game's aesthetic, and not necessarily in a bad way. That aside, there are no items to collect and, as far as I'm aware, no endings to find. It's simply an adventure for the senses. There's a wide variety of worlds, settings, and moods throughout the experience. There's moments of horror, tranquility, surrealism, nostalgia, things beyond understanding, you name it. You never know what you're in for when you transition between worlds. And there's a lot of worlds here too. 4 hours in and I was still finding new things, so who knows what I missed. In fact, I booted the game up again to get extra footage and ended up immediately finding several new areas. There's some seriously deep dream exploration going on here, to the point where I was struggling to find certain worlds and events again when I set out to return to them. I imagine mapping this game out is a bit of a nightmare for reasons I'll mention shortly, but even so, the number of locations, little quirky things, and cutscenes hidden deep into the worlds is extremely impressive. Yes, cutscenes. These are typically live action and have some interesting direction to them. They have a charming art project feel with the self-awareness necessary to not make the Plague Doctor Beak erection scene a tonal head scratcher. There isn't a conventional story here, but there are recurrent characters and vague story beats, with this Plague Doctor fellow in particular getting a lot of screen time. I shouldn't say much more about that. One of the greatest strengths of 21 The World is its authentic dreaminess. What I mean by that is I could reasonably see many of these locations appearing in my own dreams. Most other dream games lean very hard into the surreal aspect of dreams, whereas 21 strikes a believable balance between reality and unreality. Have you ever had a dream taking place in black background lampland? Probably not, though I may be underestimating how weird other people's dreams can be. It's a lot more likely that you've had a dream taking place in a mall or a dark hedge maze. Beyond that, few games have caught me off guard as often as 21. Places can change on later visits, and the rare events kept my head on a swivel. Much like when you're married, even a bedroom isn't safe from random events. Some visits an area will be safe, other visits, something is stalking you. 21 isn't a horror game at heart, but it does delve into the territory, and it's usually well handled. Usually, it does have a couple relatively cheap jump scares. Despite those, the unexpected moments you're thrown into a nightmare can be quite effective. It's a small portion of the game, and you never know when it's coming. Enemies technically aren't really a threat, they just send you to the naughty corner, aka your bedroom. Still, I jumped a couple times, and some worlds are unnerving to even be in. It's genuinely good stuff. I also want to give mention to the music. I can't play too much of it because I think a decent amount of it is copyrighted or taken from elsewhere. However, what is here is quite appropriate. The choices of tracks and their locations go a long way towards giving these strange worlds atmosphere and personality. Unfortunately, the music sources are abysmally documented and there isn't a rip of the soundtrack on YouTube or anything like that. So that's a shame. If you're willing to document or source any of these music tracks, then knock yourself out. It would be pretty nice. 21 isn't flawless, however, as it has issues with its strange, overly interconnected structuring. While the depth of the worlds is praiseworthy, it can actually be a downside sometimes. There are two big problems with exploration that go hand in hand with each other. The first, greater issue, is that you typically can't go back after entering a world. I promise I won't bring up Yume Nikki much after this, but unlike Yume Nikki, taking a wrong turn is committal. If you end up somewhere you don't want to be, Yume Nikki gives you the means to return to the previous world 9 out of 10 times. This convenience is absent in 21. If you didn't mean to go somewhere, too bad. The other issue is that a lot of worlds or interactions can lead back to the bedroom or earlier worlds with no warning. Imagine being 7 or so worlds deep, only to interact with a random object and unexpectedly end up back where you started. The game's like a bad parent who sends you back to your room because you discovered a corpse in the backyard. Certain interactable items do offer visual cues where they take you, but a decent chunk of the time that doesn't feel like the case. So it's an unholy trinity of it being easy to go somewhere you don't want to go, there being no way to head back, and the game asking you frequently to retread your steps. While the game has a decent amount of content to explore, it will not be long before you start seeing certain worlds over and over again. It also doesn't help that the two biggest sub-hubs take a few worlds to reach. You really want to memorize a quick route to the Door World and the Samurai Disco Mall dungeon, since they both lead to a ton of other places. They're not necessarily far away, but it's a minor inconvenience that does kind of stack up. It's also worth noting that 21 is relatively unrefined. It probably eats with a spork, or worse yet, its hands. You can easily fall out of certain maps or softlock yourself. Thankfully, you can hit enter to open a prompt and type in help to work back to your bedroom. I only found 2 other things you could enter into this prompt, and I'll let you figure those out yourself. The game is weird and often reduces your movement speed or steals your ability to jump. I'm not sure why, but it stuck with me between maps a couple times. Oh, and 21 sporadically features first-person platforming. As someone who finds this to be the only bearable form of platforming, I don't mind it, but the controls are awkward and slippery. You're usually expected to do these segments in one go, so you really do need to adjust to the awkwardness. You want to partake in a Reese's Puffs cow, right? Overall, 21 is an excellent experience, a definitive dream exploration game if I've ever seen one. Its hitches are a bit significant, but they never detracted from the experience enough to sour my opinion on it. If you're interested in surreal or dream games at all, I would highly recommend it. Since it's free, all it will cost is your time and hard drive space. It's probably my favorite of today's lineup, partially because I think this is exactly what a game made by me would look like. It's just wild, crazy worlds to explore. I have a big soft spot for this kind of thing. But I can only praise this for so long, so let's move on to the next title. Next up is something one of a kind, Yedoma Globula, a strangely fitting name. This is an aimless trip through a grotesque, procedurally generated cosmic horror fractal hellscape. I'd call that word salad, but I don't think these environments are vegetarian. It's as close as you could get to body horror without actually being body horror. It's oddly unsettling, or maybe obviously unsettling, I guess it depends on the person. You're thrown, with no stated objective, into this destructible surreal landscape. This landscape that warps and regrows with accompanying fleshy noises whenever you destroy it. There's a handful of different areas you can visit, each of which being indescribable in a different indescribable way. Some look vaguely like clusters of blisters, others look like Baphomet's backside. I don't know what eldritch being the creator prayed to make these graphics. They're certainly impressive and unlike anything I've seen before. Given how complex some of the shapes are, it's a miracle this game runs as well as it does. You can be swallowed by this terrain, which is especially horrifying when it happens out of the blue. I have no idea if Yedoma was intended to be horror in the first place. This seemingly unintentional mix of both body and existential horror end up making a surprisingly freaky game. As for the gameplay, Yedoma is largely a walking simulator. Literally largely, the map is ludicrously massive. If you told me it was significantly bigger than Rhode Island, I'd believe you. You have a small assortment of tools to help you navigate this absurdist hellscape. Some examples include a pick for climbing, a flare gun, a monitor that lets you peek into other zones, and a recharging grenade launcher for explosively Heinrich Schliemanning your way through the world. A notable feature is the ability to dual wield these tools. Unfortunately, many of them do not work properly in your left hand. Not the first game I played with broken left-handing. It's the better hand, so it's a real disservice in this case. I understand that Yedoma is unfinished, as I'll discuss shortly, but it's odd how many of the tools don't function at all with this feature. And among these tools is the only thing to offer a purpose, this strangely ominous radio. It helps locate nearby beacons throughout the map using both sound cues and rough visual cues when you're facing in the right direction. These beacons feature teleporters, which take you to completely different parts of the world and often grant you access to a flyable boat, which has a built-in teleporter. I can only assume that these are powered by the same nightmare fuel that powers everything else. There's some suspense to using teleporters here. Dilly-dallying into a teleporter all willy-nilly may lead you inside a flesh hole eager to chew you up. I should mention that the radio is a tiny bit of sound design genius. Bust it out and you frequently get blasted with odd droning, static, and clicking noises. I find it simultaneously adds a feeling of aloneness and a sense that there might be something out there other than mysterious abandoned outposts. There's just something about it that makes the soundscape even more eerie than it already is. The sound design in general is excellent for how minimalist it usually is. Big example being the freakish fleshy noises the terrain makes as it regenerates. It also created a genuine moment of panic when my grenade launcher started loudly beeping and refusing to fire as the walls of Cthulhu's nutsack closed in around me. Even though you can't die, it's fairly horrifying. All around, the sound design only contributes further to the aforementioned horror themes. But this game has one big underlying flaw for me, and it's the poor mobility. I've neglected to mention that Yedoma has a jetpack, mostly because it's rather pitiful and the pick is often better. Your base movement speed and the boat floatment speed are slow as well. I usually don't have a problem with slow movement speed, but in a map this large, where landmarks are so few and far between, yeah, it detracts from the experience and makes me wish I had more means to get from place to place, or at least return to beacons and boats I've been to previously. To close this section off, I should make it clear that I'm playing the demo version of Yedoma. It's not a demo as such, rather it's an earlier build of the game. The most recent build apparently has multiplayer support. I imagine that's interesting, but $10 for a novelty like that? Not even considering the need to convince someone else to buy it? It's just too steep for my jetpack. In addition, as of recording this, development is stuck in an indefinite hiatus due to the Russo-Ukrainian war. The developer is Russian and openly detests the war. We can only hope they're doing well. It's unclear if Yedoma will ever be finished. It's a shame because it makes me yearn for a full-fledged game based around a concept with proper objectives, threats, landmarks, and more means of exploring. Also, I feel like it needs dwarves. Something about this game screams dwarves to me. Still, it's a fun, unique novelty, worth a peek if you like the idea of wandering into a fractal nightmare. I would recommend giving it a whirl, at least a demo. The multiplayer could be pretty interesting, but I don't know if I'm willing to make the plunge. If you go for it, good luck. Here's a quick palate cleanser, Soup 0.9. This is an influential Japanese weirdcore game dating back to 2007, so it was far ahead of the curve. Soup is just about the bare minimum a game can be, and it doesn't even have any soup. All you do is move around and take in a bunch of small cube worlds. Moving and looking around is oddly challenging. Arrow keys doing double duty for both turning and moving in a 3D game made after 2000 is probably the most surreal part of the experience. Anyways, Soup is a series of 25 small cube worlds with greatly varying imagery and music. The game closes itself every 5 worlds, with each of these 5 world sessions being considered a day. There's ostensibly not much to that beyond unlocking a level select after the 5th day. Soup is ultimately all about taking in the atmosphere, which varies wildly from world to world. Sometimes it's a cacophony to the senses, other times it's a lot more calming. Since each of these is literally a small cube, there isn't much to see, but I feel as though there's a surprising amount of personality in these tiny realms. Being such a small glimpse into these worlds is half the charm of Soup. It leaves a lot to the imagination while also being a nice sampler of the ambiguous and weird. For me, the music is the most memorable part of the experience, and thankfully it is uploaded in its entirety on YouTube. It's a rather unique beast, consisting of short Yume Nikki-esque loops that manage to have a surprising amount of soul to them. I couldn't help but go back and listen to it immediately after completing a game for the first time. It's a great soundtrack for setting the mood, and many people mention it invoking nostalgic feelings, which I can kind of see. The only real problem with Soup 0.9 is that it's freakishly short. You can easily beat it in 10 minutes. It's unfortunate, though it's clearly left an impact on most people who've played it, so so I guess it does what it sets out to do well. Soup gets a thumbs up for being quaint, unexpectedly charming, and memorably bizarre, even if it is a little disappointingly short. Let's jump to a title considerably grander in scale with Vomitoreum, spelled with an E for whatever reason. This is the most gameplay heavy title of today's lineup, and I have a lot to say about it. In fact, I teased this one at the end of my video on The Hunt, but I ended up not having enough to say to comfortably make a standalone video on it. Anyways, Vomitoreum is a Metroidvania FPS inspired by the paintings of Polish painter Zdzisław Beksiński. Geez, Europeans, why can't you have pronounceable names like, say, Glup Scrubgoat? I had never heard of him prior to this, but I enjoyed the intense dark surrealism body horror aesthetic he has going on. I can see a bit of it in Vomitoreum itself, though it's a rather subtle influence. I think it's largely its own beast. The aesthetic is rather unique, easily being one of my favorite parts of the game. Vomitoreum is a 2.5D game running on the GZ Doom engine. I'm sure any mathematicians in the audience hate the term 2.5D. I guess you can say it makes you want a vomitorium. The GZ Doom engine is a strange one, and I find that a lot of games using it have an uncanny visual style where they're a mix of pixel art and overly flashy modern visual effects. The somewhat obnoxious fog aside, Vomitoreum is thankfully largely free of this, and in spite of its mildly amateurish sprite work, it has distinctive charm. I wouldn't call the art bad, just rough around the edges. However, that twinge of amateurishness adds ambiguity and madness that ends up going a long way, possibly further than the developers intended. It's one of those cases where you have to use your imagination to fill in some blanks, and that makes the strange things a lot more interpretive and mysterious. There's a hazy fever dream nightmare atmosphere here that I adore, though it is a bit weird that the weapons are rather modern in design. Come on, you've got an excuse to make them as bizarre and Zdzisław-esque as you want. Another dash of creativity here would have made the arsenal exceptionally memorable. It's also worth mentioning that the sound design is above average. Combat sounds good with its mix of punchy weapons and macabre sounding enemies. The ambience and music are incredibly moody and help make the world feel like an apocalyptic alien hellscape. This soundscape is surprisingly immersive. It's easily some of the best I've heard in the GZ Doom engine. Too bad about the single exceptionally obnoxious player pain sound though. Po Buddy's nerfed, I suppose. Unlike most of today's other titles, Vomitoreum has a proper story. You're a humanoid creature designed by Skeleton Crowman specifically to save the world from a return of a being named Vomitoreum. It already effectively caused the apocalypse by turning most of humanity into monsters, and it's coming back to finish the job. As one of the only living beings left, you're politely suggested to perform a series of Metroidvania-y objectives to reach Vomitoreum and defeat it. And that's mostly it. After the intro lore dump, you're hucked into the world without much direction to start with. I think that's good. The developers trust the player to find things on their own, and the map is designed in such a way to naturally guide you to the majority of important locations. I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, I typically dislike using the term edgy, but it's the best way to describe the bulk of the writing here. Outside of one optional lore-heavy area, it's riddled with profanity and adult themes in such a way that it comes across as juvenile. It doesn't seem particularly self-aware, which really hurts it in my eyes. Outside of this, it's largely passable. It just wasn't the thing that kept me playing. This is the last I'll mention of the story, both to avoid spoilers and because I don't think it's particularly worth talking about in much detail. Vomitoreum is pseudo-open world, to best put it. It's modest in size, fairly dense, and it doesn't waste much of your time, owing to its decent signposting, environmental variety, and abundance of secrets. As a Metroidvania, this world is your own pinata stuffed full of upgrades and collectibles. Most upgrades are boilerplate things like health boosts, though you infrequently find new movement abilities, weapons, and alt fires. The pacing of upgrades is smooth and consistent, so it always feels like you're making forward progress, even if you've strayed far from your current objective. The abilities are rather satisfying, or at least memorably weird. An example of the latter is the ability to transform into a slippery fetus. Yeah, you heard that right. It's good for fast traveling through freakishly rectangular birth canals. Your character screams when you transform to and from this form, which is the mark of a good power-up. There are also two collectibles scattered about the world, the marketable plushy bait homunculi and the horrible totems. These are reasonably hidden a majority of the time, however sometimes you're expected to have psychic premonition. This really pissed me off, so I feel the need to specifically mention it. One totem has you look downwards off the edge of a random cliff to find it. It's not eye-catching, at least not for anyone without a third eye. The reward for finding all the totems is both the worst weapon in the game and a swim in Eldritch Gamer Girl bathwater. It's not worth it.
I can take it.
Kiss me.
Most of these collectibles are otherwise reasonable, but you're only rewarded for finding all of them, so good luck. Moving along, given that Vomitoreum is running on the GZ Doom engine, there's an inherent doominess to the gameplay. You have the standard Usain Bolt boltiness, hordes of bad guys to shoot, and an arsenal you carry around in its entirety. Well, mostly. Certain weapons are replaced by alternatives as you progress, such as the pump-action shotgun becoming a double barrel. Despite what you might intuit, the double barrel shotgun is fully automatic and it lets you triple jump. Weapons that improve your jumping abilities are a rare novelty I've been fascinated by since the machine gun and cave story. Speaking of machine guns, a starting revolver turns into a machine gun, which can get a cryo alt fire that freezes enemies and creates platforms on water. Truly, ice is cool. I really enjoyed the crossbow in the late game too, definitely super overpowered, but you need to put in some effort to get it. With only one exception, the weapons are fun, meaty, somewhat literally, and even punchy, literally. There's close to nothing to complain about here. Well, nothing significant to complain about with the weapons themselves. While the arsenal and abilities can be fun or at least novel, the game never rises to the challenge the player issues to it. This is the only game in today's lineup to have proper combat, yet it's not particularly harder than your average walking simulator. Sure, our crow-descended protagonist starts with enough health to accidentally be killed by a blank round. In fact, before you get the diving suit, you straight up die from contact with water. I'm gonna assume this game takes place in Michigan. Anyways, all it takes is a couple easily findable health upgrades to unleash your ultimate supreme power of having way too much health. Compound that with abundant healing items, frequent save points, and infinite ammo, and Vomitoreum becomes kind of a pushover. And yes, you can quite literally endlessly fire your Gatling double barrel shotty. Sounds fun in theory, but I feel something is missing when even bosses are helpless against it. Plus, having to reload your double barrel is half the fun. It's basically gun ASMR. I only died once in my blind playthrough, and it was because of a boss randomly one-shotting me, which it never did again. It's not a good look when the only dangerous thing in the entire game feels like it was either a glitch or an oversight. Like they accidentally put an extra 0 at the end of some number. And it doesn't help that most of your abilities are only useful for navigating the environment. No fights ever require you to perform a dash, create ice platforms, transform into the infant form, etc. In fact, the few times I tried using anything other than guns in combat, I often ended up at a disadvantage. They're fun to use for navigation purposes, but the combat never asks you to utilize your expanding moveset. It's wasted potential, and wasted potential is always an upset for me. The combat movement and exploration ultimately feel fundamentally disconnected from each other. Plus, encounters, especially in the case of bosses, were seemingly designed to the expectation you might have few to no upgrades at all going into them. I actually do appreciate that the bosses were designed to be completely dodgeable. I got into a satisfying groove sometimes, even if that groove is typically the highly technical Doom Engine patented strategy of moving in a big circle. But because of how lopsidedly player favored the power scaling is, only a couple of the bosses pose even the slightest threat to you. Similarly, most enemy mob encounters are small scale, with foes that don't hit hard at all, die fast, and struggle to hit you. Combat is not a small part of Vomitoreum, so this overwhelming number of issues regarding the balancing, pacing, and moveset design really hold the game back. Also, Vomitoreum is unusually heavy on boobs. I mean, the game does warn you on its store page that a lot of enemies are nude or resemble genitalia. Beyond that, there's an infinite titty gore river. Sure, it's all effectively 16-bit, but it counts. This is a stellar opportunity to retire that one running gag I usually use to make fun of horny developers, but kinda regret coming up with it since it doesn't reflect well on me either. It's worth noting that the developer made another shooter called Hellwomb, and the thumbnail is, as a gynecologist would describe it, a gaping demon coochie on a Super Nintendo. Maybe this is an obscure fetish like the crucified topless succubi later on. In fact, there's no way it's not a fetish. These succubi are concentrated in the worst part of the game, where you're surrounded by death pits in a cave where you can only see 2 femto inches ahead of yourself. I hate this kind of thing so much. I can only imagine this is a layer of hell personalized just for me. This is the only properly bad level design here, but there's one other big thing contributing to it. The fact that your sole light source has its own AI that just does whatever the fuck it wants. This is genuinely rage-inducing for me. I hate dark segments in shooters, and this is especially torturous. No auto map, by the way, so there's no outwitting this. Weh. So, Vomitoreum. It's certainly a mixed bag, and I've done a deeper analysis than I originally expected to be doing. Still, knowing its caveats, I would recommend snatching it, especially if you can catch it on sale. The art style is strange and memorable, the atmosphere is good, weapons feel punchy, and there's fun to be had exploring the world. It's ambitious while still managing to feel quaint and humble. It's no reinvention of the wheel, and it certainly has problems with difficulty balancing and little annoying bits of backtracking. At a bare minimum, it's a fun afternoon killer. It's a sole game on here I went back to replay immediately after beating it properly, so I'd say it's worth your time. Flawed but memorable and decent enough. What more could you really ask for? Now for something that reflects game design madness rather than classical everyday madness. Scanner Sombre is a game that personifies great idea, bad execution. It's a walking simulator featuring a unique gimmick known as LiDAR, an actual real-world thing meaning light detection and ranging. I don't know why the I is part of the acronym, but I guess it's a tad catchier than LDAR. This gimmick means that you can only see through the uses of a scanner, which paints the environments around you with color-coded dots. You have to point it and hold it down where you want to see, though you get functionality for a massive burst scan. Like the mighty T-Rex, it is unable to properly pick up motion, so who knows what's lurking in these dark caves. I do want to say that I love the idea of the scanner. It's an intriguing gimmick that also gives the game a unique, somewhat surreal art style. There's something oddly beautiful about the dot outlines of the environment, especially how colorful they can be at times. The act of scanning itself is oddly satisfying, and I never got sick of scanning the world around me across the 2-hour runtime. Between the visual style and the LiDAR gimmick, Scanner Sombre has a unique foundational appeal. The problem is that on top of this solid foundation, they built the dot outline of a giant nothing burger. You might reasonably assume that this is a horror game. The LiDAR gimmick seems like it could easily make for unique horror. Well, it tries to be scary, I think? And it flounders pretty hard. This game is a tonal catastrophe that makes a serial polygamous cheater look committal. It seemingly wants to unease you, only to then transition to a segment where calm acoustic music plays while you're on a boat ride. It tries to sell the presence of threats, but as far as I could tell, the only real danger is falling into a bottomless pit and reloading an autosave from 30 seconds ago. It's a total non-issue. Beyond that, the biggest scare's in the first 5 minutes. All it is an A-posing dude teleporting behind you and making a loud sound. It never tries doing anything punchier or, dare I be exceedingly brutal, more creative than this. Like I said, I feel like there's an enormous amount of horror potential here. LiDAR could easily capitalize on the fear of the unknown and unidentifiable. So naturally, the only thing Scanner Sombre throws at you to spook you is a couple harmless, overly detailed, blatantly humanoid apparitions. There's having a good idea but not fully capitalizing on it, and then there's this. Even if there is a sense of tension early on, the total lack of good payoffs and poor uses of the LiDAR gimmick makes it all feel hollow. You'll never see something unusual in the corner of your scanner's vision. You'll never witness an ambiguous shape moving as you're trying to scan. You'll never find yourself in a pit without your bearings or anything interesting, period. It's all embarrassingly mundane, uninspired, and scripted. I should also mention that the story's meandering. It's one of those stories that feels like it might go somewhere interesting, and then it doesn't. The ending in particular feels extremely abrupt, overly dramatic, and unearned. It's an abysmal payoff, and I couldn't help but laugh when I saw the option for New Game Plus appear. Yeah, no. It's apparently the same thing but with one minor change to the intro. Sure sounds like they put a lot of effort into that. Scanner Sombre is ultimately little more than a funky novelty. It was occasionally enjoyable in a moment, but looking back after beating it, I cannot recommend it wholeheartedly. Like I said, great idea, hilariously bad execution. To give this game a small break, it does seem like it was the first attempt to make anything like it, having been released in 2017. In 2022, we would get a LiDAR Gmod add-on to standalone LiDAR.exe. Both of these utilize the limitations and implications of the technology way better. Even if LiDAR.exe is incredibly brief and ends in one of the cheesiest jump scares I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot of them, believe me, it actually tries to be scary and unique. I should also add that they're free, while Scanner Sombre isn't. While I do like the aesthetics of Scanner Sombre, there's so much more horror and creativity in the aforementioned free games. I do like the rainbow dots, there's something cozy about that. If you're only in it for the aesthetic and the novelty of LiDAR, maybe Scanner Sombre is worth a shot on sale. Otherwise, I just suggest having 30 minutes of fun a pop with those two aforementioned titles instead. Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams is a relatively recent and popular release in comparison to everything else on here, though I have had it on my weird game radar since it first released. Despite that, I don't know what I expected going into this game, though a story-driven puzzle platformer wasn't too high on that list of expectations. I think it's trying to evoke the spirit of old-school 3D platformers, just without the spirit of the horrific motion sickness and depth perception issues that came with those. This game has quite a bit to it, and much like 21 The World, I suggest you go into it largely blind. Again, this video is a sampler pack and not a full analysis of each of these titles. Hypnagogia is rather distinct from most other dream exploration games. It's dialogue heavy and linear with more first-person platforming than you could shake a stick at in first person. It's cozy platforming, rarely taxing, with only light punishment for mistakes. Beyond that, it's more about exploring and light puzzle solving in a variety of strange worlds. Hypnagogia is fairly relaxed all around, which I guess is appropriate for something themed around dreams. There is a subtle descent into a nightmare going on as you play, with later levels getting darker in tone and or more horror themed. Sometimes it's soothing, sometimes it's horrifying. It's tonally varied, that's for sure. This game aims for quality over quantity. There aren't a shocking amount of worlds, and you'll rarely spend more than half an hour on any given world, but they all have their own distinctive aesthetic. No two places feel remotely similar, and there's often a decent number of things to look at or find. In particular, I really love the snow level, though I'm a sucker for snow in general. I think this level is a peak at the world design, but the worlds in Hypnagogia are largely excellent, and I was always looking forward to whatever came next. They generally walk a fine line between the surreal and dreamlike. It's a unique and comfortable place to be, and it lends Hypnagogia a lot of its identity. Though beyond the worlds being interesting and pleasant to look at, I have mixed feelings about the PS1 style visuals. It's really not my thing. A lot of people seem to like it, but the aliasing and holes in the universe are distracting for me. Still, it doesn't detract too much from the world design itself. Plus, the music does a fantastic job building the atmosphere. If you're looking for a game with a dreamy, literally and figuratively, soundtrack to listen to, this is easily the best title in today's lineup. It's this set of calm but catchy atmospheric tracks that overwhelmingly nail the mood of the levels. I give the music a sharp A. That's a terrible joke. While I did say Hypnagogia is linear, there is an astounding amount of missable content. Seriously, I'd say you miss out on over half the game if you don't find the secret worlds. I missed out on a few secret levels because my accumulated video game instincts tell me not to jump into conspicuous holes. Maybe some people are born to enter holes and I'm not one of them. I feel I'm more of the opposite, like someone who has holes to be. And beyond that, certain sections play out differently depending on dialogue choices and how explorative you were. Don't stress out too much about missing out on content, as you get access to a level select after beating the game. Well, better later than never. In one level in particular, you can flirt with a sentient door, which results in a lot of content you miss out on if you don't flirt with her. I feel like you really missed out on an opportunity by not actually having the flirty dialogue written out though. You could have had us call her adorable. Still, this game is the second piece of door romance fiction ever that I'm aware of. As for the first one, well, no idea where it is on the internet now, but I extend an unrelated apology. While I largely like Hypnagogia, its shortcomings are hard to ignore. For one, while I did praise the quality of most of the worlds, the stinkers are big stinkers. I personally think the mineshaft level is the most boring way the game could have started. It just feels very uninspired in comparison to every other locale. I also personally have a grudge against the underwater levels, since you have that obnoxious Quake screen warp effect on screen at all times. I complained about this in my Mars 3D video, but it's exponentially worse here, to the point where I needed to take headache medicine afterwards. Technically, this means this game is the first on my channel to actually physically hurt me. Hypnagogia also only saves progress at the start of levels. In other words, it's like real life, where you don't want to wake up right before that funky dream you're having ends properly. More autosaves or a manual save system would have really helped. As it stands, you're expected to complete each level in one burst. It's not a huge deal, but it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. Finally, I'm not going to be too specific, but I want to say that I found the final stretch a little overly dramatic and meandering. There's an enormous amount of build-up for a payoff that's only okay. I was mostly disappointed by one big thing. I thought I was going to have to make a choice at the end, but then there was no choice to be made. The game asked me to reflect on what kind of pizza I want, only to then hand me a Hawaiian without my input. Which is fine, I like Hawaiian pizza, but it's still weird to deceive me about how much agency I have. It really makes me wonder if there was an alternative cut ending, but I can only speculate. Ultimately, Hypnagogia is worth a shot. It's a bit gameplay and dialogue heavier than most other titles here, on top of being linear. I don't think any of those things are problems. It's something different from the dream exploration subgenre, and it stands out for its consistent quality, atmosphere, and charm. There's certainly a lot of love and care put into this game. It's definitely one of the best titles of today's lineup, and easily one of the most replayable. It's probably the best dream game we've gotten in years. As a result, I would recommend it to anyone interested in these sorts of titles. I don't think it's on the same level as 21 The World, but that's a personal preference, more based on how I like titles like this to play. So give it a whirl. It's fairly reasonably priced by indie title on Steam standards, and it's a memorable experience. What more could you ask for? And that's all the titles I have for today. Since it was an assortment of games, my concluding thoughts are going to be more general and disorganized. I guess today's moral is that Surreal Games come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, from the dreaminess of 21 The World to the doominess of Vomitoreum, or from the quality of Hypnagogia to the quality of Sombre. Well, they can't all be winners. I usually pick the titles in advance long before I start writing my script, so I'm rarely sure what I'm in for. Anyways, if there's two titles to try from today's lineup, I would strongly recommend 21 and Hypnagogia. Both are great surreal experiences, and if you're in deep enough to have watched this video to the end, then you're almost certain to enjoy your time with them. Most of the other titles mentioned today have their own appeal, it's just that those two are what I want from a surreal/dreamy game. Before I go, I want to let returning viewers know that my life is going to get a lot more complicated. I hope to still post video reviews sporadically, maybe try something different now and again. I also want to finish up and release one or two of my videos that have been stuck in editing hell, like the video on 7554, but I can't guarantee anything. That game was absolute irredeemable misery, and I can still feel my suffering emanating through the footage. Just not good for getting the video done. Anyways, goodbye for now, and I hope you have sweet surreal dreams about surfing through space on muscular men. See ya!